Uhuru, sisters and brothers. The first thing I want to say is that I love you. And the second thing I want to say is that we can win. We will win our liberation. And in order to win our liberation, we have got to think positively. We have got to believe that we can win. And if we don't believe that we can win, we'll whip before we start. We've got to realize what dangers exist, and we've got to look at those dangers realistically. We can't afford to have a subjective, distorted, irrational fear. We've got to look at the obstacles to our liberation coolly and clearly, and to develop ways to get rid of those, for us to struggle, for us to fight for our liberation and for our nation.
Welcome everyone. The full title of this discussion, we're calling it an ASA Freedom Course, and the title is Mutual Aid is a People's Movement Beyond Philanthropy, Charity, and Dependence on the Police State. And I'm thrilled to welcome a group of folks to talk about this. I'm going to ask everyone to go and introduce themselves one by one. I'll call out your name, and then I'll ask you all to just talk for a minute about who you are and why you're here. My name is Dylan Rodríguez. I'm the president-elect of the American Studies Association. I'll be president as of July 1, 2020. I'm professor at University of California, Riverside, and I've got long-time roots and devotions and accountabilities to different organizations and movements, including abolitionist organizations and movements. If y'all are cool with it, I'll go with you. I'll go in the order of how you all appear on my screen. Just ask you to introduce yourself. Anything you want to say about yourself is fine. Let me go with Helen. Let me start with you.
Hey y'all, my name is Helen, she, they pronouns. I've been organizing with the Dream Defenders for about 2 years now. I am a Black feminist, abolitionist, here fighting for the radical futures that we deserve. I've also co-founded a queer feminist organization called FemPower, and I'm currently working on a community bond fund through Dream Defenders and FemPower.
Hi, I'm Amika Tendaji. I'm with Ujima Medics for short. We are Chicago-based. We teach first response for gunshot wounds, asthma, seizures, etc.
Hey everyone, my name is Rachel. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm with the Dream Defenders. I've been organizing with Dream Defenders since 2015. And I'm really excited to be here in conversation about mutual aid. Dream Defenders believes in building and exercising dual power, so working inside and outside the system. So excited to be in this conversation with folks today.
Hi, I'm Dean Spade. For about 20 years, I've been working in different kinds of mutual aid organizations, a lot of which are focused on people who are criminalized or in prison or facing immigration proceedings. I teach at Seattle U in the law school, and for the last 4 years or so, I've been maintaining this website that's a mutual aid toolkit called Big Door Brigade to try to make the idea of mutual aid more accessible to more people, and make people not have to reinvent the wheel and be able to build off of each other's experiences and efforts.
Hey, I'm Armen, Henderson. I am an assistant professor of medicine at University of Miami. I'm also director of health programs with Dream Defenders and been with Dream Defenders since 2014. As part of this mutual aid, we run like a community emergency operations center, specifically during hurricanes, but throughout all crises. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, everyone. As will surprise nobody who knows her, Mariame Kaba is on another organizing call as I speak. She's just getting off it, so she's going to join us in the next minute. So in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. Mariame Kaba is the founder and director of Project NIA, a grassroots abolitionist organization that is seeking to stop the incarceration of young people. She has founded multiple organizations over the years, including the Chicago Freedom School, the Chicago Task Force on Violence Against Girls and Young Women, the Chicago Alliance to Free Marissa Alexander, and the Rogers Park Young Women's Action Team. I should say that I first got to know Mariame in her role as a co-founder and member of We Charge Genocide, an intergenerational effort to document and intervene on police violence and police brutality in Chicago, Mariame has been active in the anti-gender violence movement for over 30 years. And in addition to being a member of Insight Women of Color Against Violence, she and my wonderful UC Riverside colleague, Elisa Bieria, co-founded and actively organized the Survived and Punished Collective. Currently, Mariame is working as a researcher in residence on race, gender, sexuality, and criminalization at the Social Justice Institute of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, where she's going to be through September 2020. So I welcome Mariame to this conversation. She'll join us in just a second. Something that came to my mind that sparked, in my view, the need for this conversation is how the COVID-19 pandemic has once again kind of accentuated and amplified how the existing version of the US state and all its iterations from local to federal it is not only poorly equipped to provide medical emergency and other forms of care for large numbers of vulnerable people, but is actively organized to neglect specific and targeted populations: poor people, working people, segregated Black populations, incarcerated people, unhoused people, undocumented people, elders without caretakers, etc. So part of something that came to mind for, I think, a lot of us that are engaged with different forms of social movements and social justice and abolitionist struggles is that while mutual aid organizations and work has come to strong attention during this pandemic, it also has long historical roots in movements for survival, liberation, and abolition. So I would just like to start the conversation by asking y'all that are grounded in the work of Dream Defenders in Florida and Ujima Medics in Chicago to define mutual aid based on your organization's work and clarify for everybody that's watching this how mutual aid, as y'all see it, is different from conventional notions of charity, philanthropy, and state social services.
Yeah, I don't particularly love the term mutual aid. I think it implies, we forever have associated, that word aid with a kind of charity model. Ujima means collective work and responsibility. And so that's what we prefer, right? Your solidarity is bound up with mine. My liberation is bound up with yours. Solidarity is necessary for us to move forward. And for Black folks, and Umedics is an all-Black collective, help is not coming. And the closer you are to Black, the less help is going to come. So we have to take care of each other, figure out autonomous systems while demanding that the state, philanthropy, government, whatever government, nonprofit or for-profit entities are doing their responsibility, but with the understanding, like, we are all we have.
Could you talk about, in looking at the Umedics website and how you all define your struggle and how you ground it? What really jumps out and what should jump out for folks that are watching this that go and look at your site is how serious and rigorous you all are about grounding the way you think about your present day-to-day work in long history of hemispheric Black struggle for survival, for abolition, for transformation, for liberation, and so forth. So could you talk just a little bit about that? And because I think it's deep how you started your response by saying you actually don't like the term mutual aid. So could you talk a little bit about the Black radical traditions that y'all ground yourselves in that we can think about as alternative grounding or alternative foundations for even talking about this topic?
These are actually the skills that Black people need to have, because when anything happens, then there's not going to be, help for us, right? But also in like granny midwives who had incredible birth outcomes and low infant and maternal mortality rates, who were completely undermined and decimated by industrialized medicine. And industrialized medicine, while Umedics is made up of some healthcare professionals, is with the understanding that historically industrialized medicine is not something that Black folks could or should trust. And so we also need collectives of people who are gathering, returning to long-held knowledge and really like trying to collect that, share it with each other, and balance that with industrial medicine.
And last thing, Amika, as a quick follow-up, could you talk about what you see as the most critical day-to-day work that UMedics does right there in Chicago, and what the kind of roots and origins are of the organization and the collective?
Yeah, I mean, so predominantly we teach people skills that save lives. We teach bystander first response. We recognize that ambulance times in Chicago, which is pretty violent, we're slow, and folks weren't getting the help that they need. And while we were a part of and friends with organizations that were fighting to reopen emergency rooms, get level 1 trauma centers on the South Side, and doing a lot of work that helps this problem, we needed more people to understand how to do things right there on the scene. In addition, what's really important to us is like for Black people, for brown people who really come from these like really strong traditions of ancestral medicine, right? We turn over like all autonomy to all autonomy over our bodies to industrialized medicine. So I mean, we're not practicing like collective sharing, figuring it out. There's no like nearby, even like root woman, which they have all through like Latin America. You go to the Walgreens or you go to, the ER. Most people don't even have access to a primary care physician. And so we, day to day are talking to folks, teaching them how to do these things, and trying to have, we thought through earlier models of Black first responders. We can never reach all over or compare with the system. And so we were like, what if we just teach everybody?
So, similarly, I'd like to hear about the origins of Dream Defenders, the political and other traditions that you're grounding your work in, and what it is that y'all are responding to on the day-to-day and how you're practicing on the day-to-day. So Helen, maybe I'll jump to you first.
Thank you. Yeah, I can start off kind of by talking about what our perspective of mutual aid is. Dream Defenders often uses the phrase, "we keep us safe." Basically, while the state, in the name of safety, invests in violence and waging wars all over the world and caging our people and deporting our people, instead we're saying safety is providing lifelines for our communities and providing the basic tools that we need to survive and thrive. So it's basically us saying that we're going to care for each other while the state doesn't do its job to do so, and we're going to create new relationships, new ways of relating to each other, while pressuring the state for not doing its job. I do agree with what Amika was saying in terms of solidarity. It is an instinct of human solidarity. That's what mutual aid is. It's much bigger than just like saying, I love you. It is, yes, I love you, I care for you, I feel for you, I see you. But it's also something that we've developed as a human species, as a part of our evolution, that it's about our collective survival. It's about knowing I cannot survive if you're not surviving. So it's about making sure we're all surviving and recognizing our shared fate.
So Rachel, let me go to you on this and see if there's things that you'd like to elaborate with Dream Defenders.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is maybe just like a little bit about our founding and how we kind of came across mutual aid as like a key part of our strategy. So Dream Defenders was founded in 2012 after Trayvon Martin was killed, and young people came together from across the state of Florida to basically demand justice, which at that time was demanding for George Zimmerman to be arrested in the days after he had killed Trayvon. And a year after that, we basically did a big takeover of the Florida Capitol. And, this was like pre-Black Lives Matter, so it was like a really big movement moment, because like for me, it was like the first time that I had seen like young people of color like confronting power in that way, and it inspired action all across the country. But coming out of the Capitol, we were there for 30 days. Despite like being really like, gaining lots of like popularity and notoriety. We went from like zero followers to like 50,000 Twitter followers, and, one of our founders being on MSNBC all the time. But we didn't really like win any material change coming out of that experience. And it's because, like, you know, like, especially being in the halls of the capital of Florida, it's like we've been under like Republican trifecta control for like 20 years. We have a super far right, you know, racist set of politicians who run our state, who are in bed with, like, you know, the private prison industry and the NRA and all these different super corrupt actors. And so coming out of that experience, we really realized we needed to do some like deep assessment of what it actually meant to build power in a state like Florida as young people of color. And so one of the things we did was we actually like did a listening project across Florida. And we went and knew that like we were abolitionists, but we wanted to like see where our communities were at. And what we found in those conversations was that, you know, lots of people were like, you know, police, you know, people didn't necessarily believe that police were the answer, but they were also like, my number one issue is safety. And they couldn't like, people couldn't imagine a solution outside of police, because that's like, you know, people like, you know, that there is no alternative. People were sort of just like, we need more police because there's crime in our community. And so for us, we realized that we couldn't just be like moving campaigns that were like fighting for decarceration. We needed to do that. And that we needed to focus on elections to change the political landscape. But we actually had to be like working with the community to actually build alternatives to this system, to get people, as Helen said, to actually relate to one another differently and to like to relate to the solutions differently. And so that's when we started using like transformative justice, and exploring more with what it meant to build alternatives, and where we really landed on like this idea of we build power within the state through elections, against the state by campaigns that push the state, and then we build alternatives outside the state. And our political vision is called the Freedom Papers. It's a abolitionist socialist vision. That's kind of our North Star, but those are all the ways we fight for it. And yeah, it's been really amazing. I'm excited for both Armen and Helen to share more about how the projects they've built in the wake of the coronavirus, and how much, you know, it hasn't, yeah, it's not a matter of charity to our people, but it's a matter of building power with our people and building solidarity to not only make sure we have each other's backs and people have what they need, but also to like fight for a new world together and to build the political power needed to do that.
I gotta find words because y'all are so fucking brilliant. Speaking of the police, Dr. Armen, you've been very open and public about your own particular encounter with that primary contradiction and irreconcilable contradiction that was just mentioned here, you know, by Rachel, which is around this dependence, ideological dependence, I think, more than anything else, that folks have on the police as a primary provider of safety and security. And yet you recently had a direct encounter, you know, during this period of the pandemic with the police, during your everyday practice of trying to care for people as a medical doctor. So, Dr. Armen Henderson, do you think you could maybe touch on that? I'm trying to be sensitive to the fact you're probably tired of talking about this too, but maybe you could touch on this as a way to get at another dimension of what Dream Defenders does and what you do as a practicing doctor in relation to the work of Dream Defenders.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I could not have gotten arrested at a better time. I mean, honestly, you know, we were delivering tents to homeless individuals, and you know, I was in front of my house, and of course I got arrested or detained, and honestly, if it wasn't for my wife who decided to put it on social media, I wasn't even like thinking about it that day. I had so many other things that I had to do, that people started to like pour in support and you know, be upset, and then, you know, I saw the video, etc., so I released it. But, you know, we really, well, actually, let me go back. So I started organizing with Dream Defenders in 2014 when I came to Miami for residency. And ever since then, you know, it's just been like listening project for me personally around what my contribution to Dream Defenders could be. And of course, I participated in a bunch of campaigns that they had going on. Alongside of that, I was also working with people in the community as well that are sort of related to Dream Defenders, but not, but still doing similar work. And what we came to the conclusion of doing basically is something that's similar to what Amika was defining around gun violence, teaching people how to bandage gunshot wounds and approach situations with tact, so that you get the right response from police and hospitals and stuff like that. But also in crisis as well. And so Miami is at the helm of climate change. We get hurricanes every year, and basically what we've seen is that specifically during 2017, during Hurricane Irma, we saw that the government really just neglected vulnerable populations, Black populations throughout Miami-Dade County, and honestly it was throughout the state. And so we really just got fed up, I think, and said that we're just going to do it ourselves. And so at that time, I didn't know we were calling it mutual aid. Like it was just like community members stepping up and filling a void where the government didn't. And I think it is in a tradition to kind of shame the government into doing what they say that they're going to do on paper, but that they really don't. And so through that, we were able to build like a network of individuals who knew that the government didn't have the best interest at hand for vulnerable communities. And so we every year we just come with the expectation that we're going to step up and do something during hurricane season. And I think it really came to fruition during this pandemic where okay. So basically, when I got arrested, we were serving, the unsheltered population in Miami-Dade County, and of course we gained traction already, but the arrest really gave it extra traction, and so we kind of used the media that was garnered to draw attention to the way the state was treating unsheltered populations, and for the most part, right now I would say it's really been working. Okay, yeah, give me a second. And yeah, I mean, we're working to get people off of the street. We're working to get people tested, giving people tents to shelter in place, providing masks. People are making masks. It was just awesome to see the same network that we're using during hurricane crisis to now be activated for this crisis, because it's almost the same sentiments that are going on, basically. And just to close, well, two things. The Dade County Street Response is an organization that we created specifically because the system of medicine is racist, it's white supremacist, it's based on capitalism, but also because physicians were becoming employees of hospitals and they didn't really know what was going on in the community. And so, the organization that I work with, we focus on getting people in tune with things that are going on in the community, getting them outside of the hospital doors as soon as possible. And so, yeah, with that said, in terms of like mutual aid and solidarity, because I had to write this for someone who asked me about it. His name was Edward Galliano. He said, "I don't believe in charity, I believe in solidarity. Charity is so vertical, it goes from the top to the bottom. Solidarity is horizontal, it respects the other person. We have a lot to learn from other people." And I really agree with that. And I think if anything, from calling it, mutual aid, we should just call it solidarity, because that's what we're doing. We're standing in our lines, and we're standing in we're putting our bodies on the line for people whom we care about, people in our community. And it's not just to say we care about you, it's that we're here for you, and here's my contribution to make sure that you're surviving like I am.
Absolutely right on. And just to reiterate, Armen and all y'all, I just want to say how much I and everyone watching appreciates you allowing us to pull on you, because I know Armen's very clear that you have many people there that need you. And I'm going to leave that in the final video. So I think it's just part of the reality of the condition, but also part of your work. Let's be real, right? This is not separate from what you just talked about. I mean, this is entirely central to how we should be thinking about the situation that you had with being detained by the police in front of your home. That you have children that right there and youngsters around you that need you, and I'm just glad that somebody was there to watch your back and make sure that this thing got politicized rather than privatized. So I appreciate your sharing that, and I'm sorry to make you have to talk about it again, but I do appreciate your sharing that. So something's come up that I know, Mariam, that you've been talking about quite a bit lately. So I wanted to maybe move to you to ask this question. Well, first, I want to ask you just a broader question about how we should be thinking about mutual aid as part of current and historical, freedom, liberation, self-determination struggles, right? But on top of that, I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts on how to navigate this tension that I think all the folks that have spoken already have been navigating for a while now, which is, what do you do in relation to the state and making demands on the state? Because part of this is you don't want to let the state off the hook for creating the kind of infrastructure and providing the kind of care and resources that people vitally and urgently need. But at the same time, everyone here is thinking from a politics that is beyond a liberal politics of just relying on the liberal state to live up to its billing, so to speak. So I don't know what you can help us with in analyzing this, Mariam.
Sure. Thanks for including me in the conversation. I have so much respect for everyone who's on this call, who I've known in multiple kinds of contexts over the last few years, and just so much appreciation for them and their work and their thinking, which informs my work and my thinking also all the time. I'll just say that for me, I've been thinking a lot. My friend Veronica introduced me couple of years ago to a way of thinking about work and organizing in our context that came from comrades of hers in Chile, who, when she was, asking questions about the relationship of her own organizing to the state, were kind of confused by her confusion and said, well, the way we think of it in our country here, in our struggle and organizing, is that for some of us, we're working inside the state to resist to the levels that we can in order to be able, based on our capacity and our ability to feed our families and all the things that are real there. So we're working inside the state to try to do what we can. And for others of us, we're constantly working against the state. So we're making demands, we're pushing from the outside. We're saying, you need to live up to your, quote, the enticements that you've created, including declarations of human rights and constitutions and narratives that you put out about what caring and protecting your populations. You need to do that. And so the pushing against it on a regular basis. And then there are folks who are doing their best to try to agitate and organize outside the state. And I know there's a huge literature and conversation about whether we can ever get outside the state, right? Like, I don't want to get into that. The conceptualization of having multiple layers and multiple fronts at which people are working is what feels most useful to me in how I'm trying to figure out how to navigate in the current moment. A lot of what we've done in transformative justice work over the last couple of decades has been to try to situate ourselves as much as possible outside the state, to try to make claims of prefiguring a world in which we want to live that we feel is, to the extent that we can be, outside of the state. So I think of a lot of what we try to do around mutual aid, and whatever terms we try to use mutual aid. It predates the word mutual aid, right? People have been trying to take care of providing for people's material needs as long as we've been people and humans, and trying to kind of figure out how to cooperate rather than to compete. That's been the case. So I like to think of the three levels and try to constantly think of how we're going to be trying to marshal those who are working inside the state and hold them accountable to resistance, how we're going to try to do the same for the folks who are against the state, and how we're going to try to operate outside of it. I think the last thing I'll say for this for now is that I really appreciate Niels Christie's conceptualization of the state stealing our conflicts. in an attempt to talk about restorative justice and the need for it, he kind of conceptualized this notion of the state has stolen our conflicts, and what we're trying to do is to actually, through restorative justice and other kinds of alternative forms of justice making, we're trying to take those conflicts back from the state and try to manage them through our social relationships with each other. I think about that as well as the fact that the state in some ways has stolen our skills. You know, we are people now who are so incredibly de-skilled at doing basic things that, in fact, because 911 is so ubiquitous, because it's so seductive, because it's 3 numbers to remember, because it means you don't even have to get involved, it's very seductive to not figure out the skills that you need in order to be able to transform conflicts in your day-to-day life, right? We, I think, in the same way, have to, through mutual aid work, what we're trying to do is reclaim our skills, the skills we need in order to be able to relate, to live together, to cooperate, to have our solidarity be matched by an actual level of skill that allows us to think about what we need to be able to do. And I'm thinking about this COVID moment as, frankly, some place where we should be figuring out the skills that we need to relearn, that we've forgotten how to use, or that have been stolen from us. This is a moment for that to be happening. So, you know, Amika speaks very much about, you know, learning how to bandage gunshot wounds. Well, you know, that's a skill we should know how to do, all of us. And that's kind of the way that they're presenting that to us is an opportunity, frankly, for us to be able to reclaim those skills that have been stolen from us. And so I think a lot about that in the context of all this conversation that we're having around mutual aid.
No, that's a brilliant analysis, and I think it pushes us to revisit, I think, the last half century of that skills stealing and skills criminalization. I'd say it's both a stealing and a diluting, but it's also been criminalized, because Niles Christie, who you just quoted, has one of the best definitions I've ever heard of criminalization, right? That first you have a bunch of human acts, then you have the state stepping in to define some of those acts as being criminal and attaching them to certain people as criminal, right? So Mariame, what you just said brings to light you know, another perspective on what Amika and Helen and Rachel and Armen have all been referring to, which is, you know, the work of Ujima Medics, Dream Defenders, and other similar organizations, and I think analogous and parallel organizations in terms of organizing politics, is drawing from this deep historical archive of everyday practices that vulnerable, enslaved, colonized, in you know, incarcerated populations have had, and which were radically politicized, you know, through different grassroots revolutionary and radical movements through much of the 20th century, and which were then seized by a combination of the state and philanthropic organizations around the early 70s into the 80s, and turned into this version of a kind of neglect state. I don't even want to call it like a kind of gutted social welfare state. It's more of a state that is actually premised on an institutionalization of targeted neglect, asymmetrical targeted neglect of certain peoples and populations, right? That brings in Dean. Dean, the work that you've been doing for years, obviously, for years and years and years, but which has come to, I think, very acute attention now because of these, you know, unprecedented pandemic type conditions, is you have a real sharp analysis, and you've offered people, I think, a highly accessible resource online to clarify what the difference is between philanthropy, charity, and even state social services, and the version of mutual aid that you're articulating and that you're trying to be in solidarity and partnership with. Could you walk us through that as a preface for people watching this that will hopefully follow up by taking a look at the website that I'm referencing of yours in the title of this piece?
Sure, yeah. I just want to say too, it's so interesting, this conversation about mutual aid and the term. I keep having this conversation with elders who, you know, people I know who've been in movements, who are in their 70s, who, you know, have been in movements doing, you know, direct support people in prison for decades, doing direct support people in all kinds of conditions, and also being part of, you know, work against U.S. military imperialism, criminalization, et cetera. And they're like, what is this term mutual aid? I've never heard of it. you're just talking about what we've always done. And I think it's just interesting to look at, I think a lot of different traditions have different words for this, and it really doesn't matter. The point is just we want words that feel politicizing. We want words that feel like it's not like volunteerism, right? That's what I think, as a through line I see. But in so many ways, and I think Mariame in some ways just said this, like people have always only survived and evolved by supporting each other's survival collectively and cooperatively. And then colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy came in and was like, let's divide you up. Let's make sure that you can't share. Let's put you in competition. Let's make you have to go through us to get your necessities. Let's go through our food system, go through our housing system, right? And then people have survived despite that by still doing what we call mutual aid together. And in most social movements, mutual aid is the thing that most people are involved in. So you hear in our US, twisted, limited version charismatic leaders, the person who signed the law, the person who shook hands with the president, the person who had the most famous speech. But the ordinary people, and especially most often women and women of color, doing the actual social movement work is the care work, is the how do we all survive work. And that's also the on-ramp to social movements, right? And so you see the most visible examples of this we talk about on the left in the US are things like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers in the 1970s doing these mutual aid programs like free breakfast or taking over Lincoln Hospital. These were the places where people who are supposed to be demobilized, because we're all supposed to be demobilized, get to like say, hey, look, this group is doing this thing that meets my immediate needs and gives me a framework for destigmatizing my poverty and the fact that my community is in this position, and I can join up with it and build this shared analysis and learn how to spin this into collective action to get to the root causes. Like that's so important about mutual aid, is this on-ramp to how to join, right? And because we need to mobilize hundreds of millions of people for change, this is so important right now because we have really effectively been demobilized, right? Like you look at in the US, a lot of people are just like, I'm only supposed to give to the ACLU or post on social media about my views. I'm not supposed to be in it with everybody, right? And so I think this COVID-19 moment is interesting for that reason, to talk about this difference between solidarity and charity that we're all talking about. I really want to point to the Insight anthology about the nonprofit industrial complex, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which Dylan's introduction to that in that book has so much power in it. And so much of it's women of color feminist analysis of how this nonprofit system built and how the social service system built to do a couple of things, to depoliticize survival work and to say, oh yeah, I mean, as Dylan says brilliantly, like we're going to basically assassinate and imprison people who are doing root causes work, right? With COINTELPRO and all of the sort of attacks on our movements. And then we're going to give chump change to people who will do depoliticized service work. So this is a direct attack on what the Black Panthers and the Young Lords are trying to do, which is politicized survival work, right? And so there's a lot of big differences to notice between there, right? Like the model of charity and social services is a model where rich people decide who's eligible for services. They fund only those projects that frame services in the way they like. And the way they like is to say there's something wrong with people who are in need, instead of there's something wrong with systems that put people in need. So, are you homeless? Well, you need to be sober. You need to take these meds and not these other pills. Then maybe you'll qualify to be on a wait list for 1 million years for housing. And a very small number of people will get very temporary survival. That's charity's framework. It keeps things the same as much as possible. It keeps the status quo going, keeps rich people rich, poor people poor, keeps the extraction going, and doesn't lead people to be mobilized towards root causes. It blames poor for poverty, right? Social mutual aid or solidarity work, all the stuff we're talking about, is the exact opposite. It says, oh, you're homeless? Well, that's because of a capitalist housing market. That's because of white supremacy. That's because of heteropatriarchy. We want to give everybody everything they need with no strings attached, no special criteria, and move towards collective action that will get to the root causes. So that's, I think, a kind of fundamental difference. And the way that part of what matters about that right now with COVID-19 is when you get a kind of mainstreaming of the idea of mutual aid, like it's in a lot of media and stuff, we have the danger, just as you said at the beginning, Dylan, of people, because we've been raised in a culture with charity, applying that stuff in their mutual aid projects. So being only sober people can move into this housing we've just occupied, or only, this stuff comes up. We have those modes in us. That saviorism is something people fall into, those kinds of hierarchical, really colonial structures, putting that on top of our collaborations together. So how do we keep it horizontal? How do we keep it focused on mobilizing? How do we make these projects and movements grow and split into more and more, instead of having them get really small and cliquish and you have to have the right jargon? These are some of the challenges that I think people are facing.
Mariame, you wanted to add something.
Yes, I just wanted to add one quick thing to the conversation that's been had already, and just to point people once again to concrete examples that maybe they even have heard of before but haven't thought of in the context of mutual aid. And one of the most successful, at least in the 20th century, examples beyond the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party that have been mentioned already is the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And I just think, you know, sometimes we kind of obscure what is really just basically very simple. And the Montgomery Bus Boycott, as a direct attack on the state not providing transportation to mostly Black women who were the ones using that transportation to go and basically be able to economically provide for their families, since they were the domestics and the cooks and in white people's homes, they were taking that public transportation, saying no, in fact, we don't want to be second-class citizens. But we deserve a right to be able to, you know, use these services in this way. So in order to do that, for a year, what did people have to do? People had to arrange for carpools for everybody so that they wouldn't take public transportation. People had to cook in order to be able to raise money that would continue to fund the thing all over again. People had to be present for each other. There were no strike funds. People were basically raising that through their own means to make sure that people who couldn't get to work could still survive. You know, like, these were the things that were going on. And I think if people just take a look at our history, and I'm saying in this case in the US context, you can really see the way that survival work was directly part of political work that was intended to shift the power imbalance that Black people were experiencing in a colony within a colony. So I think that, you know, I just wanted to point that out to folks who often ask, like, what is a concrete example? I don't know what that looks like. What is, like, that's not charity, right? That was deep political organizing.
No, absolutely. And I would just add to that. We have this rich and still growing history of prison strikes and jail strikes and detention center strikes, where all forms of organizing are happening among people who are in the most focused subjection to state violence. People who are absolutely isolated from other human contact and yet are finding creative ways to organize these mass struggles that end up spreading across the country to directly transform the conditions that are proto-genocidal inside these different sites of incarceration. So yeah, these traditions are actually, we have a wealth of these traditions to draw from. We just need to have a kind of analysis and a language to facilitate it. So that kind of leads me to the last part of our conversation. Again, I appreciate y'all being here together with us and sharing this with everybody. I wanted to ask a question that's specific to the conditions of right now, meaning the COVID-19 pandemic and the different forms of vulnerability, of illness, of casualty that people are suffering. I'd like to ask, you know, our folks here, Amika, Helen, Rachel, Armen, I'd like you all to talk a little bit about how you see your organizations responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, the communities and the people that you're seeing that are most in need of care, of what we were calling mutual aid, maybe still are calling mutual aid during this pandemic, and why? Like, is there anything in particular about this pandemic that brings new things to your attention into the organizational work?
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, everyone. I've really been learning a lot from all of you. So immediately, Dream Defenders' train of thought was, of course, as soon as this broke out, was to think about what are the most vulnerable communities that we need to show up for in this moment. And so what we started off with was, of course, the street team in terms of just going to the Overtown community, which is a historically Black and poor community, to provide free testing for houseless people with Armen, provide basic things like masks, gloves, hand wipes to stay sanitary, to stay safe, and then also providing people with tents, food, hot food, showers, porta potties to go use the restroom, and then also putting pressure on the institutions whose job it is to take care of these people, like the Houseless Trust, who haven't been doing their job. So that also ties into the bail work that I kind of spoke to earlier that we've been doing in collaboration with FemPower, it's a similar population. A lot of the reason why people are in jail is because they don't have homes, so they can't be released, and they're being detained because Miami and South Florida is in a housing crisis. And so we knew that one of the most vulnerable communities was obviously our people on the inside. Jails are death traps always, but especially right now, we have thousands, I think over 5,000 people in Miami-Dade County jails right now. And of course, the people on the inside cannot social distance. That is not an option. There's 30 to 40 people in a cell at a time. Everyone's sharing everything. Everyone's scared. We've been getting calls and emails nonstop about how worried people are to lose their lives, to lose their loved ones' lives. Several people have tested positive already, and there's not a form of communication happening from inside to outside, so we're not really knowing exactly what's going on. And so, of course, our response was to start fundraising to bail people out and to really preserve their lives and just like show up for our people. So we're providing them with housing. Once they get out, we're providing people with food and connecting them to social services. We've also have created a hotline where we can connect to people on the inside, listen to what their conditions are, and bailing them out wherever we can. This is a kind of model that we're adapting statewide. We've started off in Miami, and we're gonna do this all across the state of Florida to get as many people out as possible. And you know, like Dylan was talking about, as using mutual aid as an on-ramp for how to join the work and to build power, we're connecting people to our campaign work, to our campaign called Free the Block, which is about ending money bail and pretrial detention in Miami. So that's how it's sort of all coming together. And that's a little bit about what's happening in Miami right now. So far, we've bailed out 10 people and have gotten out 3 people out on house arrest. And we're gonna keep doing it until we can get people out. This is also a part of a broader campaign to, we're basically pushing for our state attorney to release them all. We're pushing for the judges and the mayor Jimenez to release people because of course we can only do like what we can with the money that we raise, but this is the state's job to release people right now, and we're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen all over the world right now too. So we're basically doing this in order to pressure the state to do their job as well.
The bail work that y'all are doing brings to light that the fact that for a lot of people who aren't 1 or 2 degrees connected to somebody, a loved one who's incarcerated, who's been through the system, for some of the folks that feel themselves to have a relative distance from the so-called criminal justice system, it's their first time realizing that the overwhelming majority of people who are in jails have not been convicted of a crime. You know, it's such a basic rudimentary fact of the U.S. criminal justice apparatus that for some reason the common sense of criminalization is so deep that there's a profound lack of widespread understanding that that's what a jail is, right? It's where you keep basically poor people who haven't been convicted of anything and who can't afford bail. So that kind of work is deep, and I think it's pushing an abolitionist kind of analysis and politics forward. So let me go to you, Rachel, and then Armen, if it's cool, I'll go to you next to talk a little bit more about Dream Defenders. Oh.
Yeah, just the only thing I'll add, and Armen can speak more to this, but you know, with the street team, in the first couple of weeks of Armen leading the street team, we got lots of press, and the press really wanted to present it as like a feel-good story, like, look at this amazing University of Miami doctor with all these community members going out and serving the homeless community. And they just really wanted to make it seem like this feel-good feature story in the wake of the pandemic. And we had to be really intentional to be like, no. Like, we are not superheroes, and it is not revolutionary to be going out and making sure people have the basic things that they need in the face of the pandemic. And how do we use the work that we're doing to like turn up on the state and actually hold them accountable to the real things that they should be doing for people right now. And so we made a real intentional effort to actually try to pivot away from the feel-good story. And like this past week, we did a big press conference where we like put pressure on, basically we have a homeless trust in Miami who gets $90 million a year to make sure that homeless people, you know, support homeless people around their needs. And they're not really doing anything right now. And so we used the press conference to talk about the fact that the state's in action and put pressure specifically on the head of the homeless trust, who also happens to be a lobbyist for the for-profit prison company, the GEO Group, and really draw the connections between like 25% of the people who have been arrested right now on the streets who have been arrested and sent through the jail system since the corona outbreak are homeless. We're passing out tents. The state is then police are then coming and crushing those tents because of loitering laws. And so we're really just trying to use sort of the fact that people, I think, you know, are drawn to the work that we're doing to then say, hey, this is not a feel-good story, and point the finger back to the state. And not only the inaction, but the fact that their solution is criminalizing people and using resources to criminalize people as opposed to putting people in housing. You know, we're in Miami, there's empty high rises all over our city, empty hotel rooms, and the city could certainly use those to house people. And so really drawing out the state's ineffectiveness. And I think we're actually starting to gain a lot of traction and like starting to see that we're maybe, you know, actually starting to gain traction on some of our demands, which is exciting.
Outstanding. No, Armen, can you talk a little bit more about the work that you've been doing, in your medical practice, perhaps, in relation to COVID-19 and the pandemic conditions?
Yeah, I mean, so I've just been focusing more so on testing individuals. As you see all across the United States, the number of tests that people are getting, particularly those who live in, you know, Black and low and working class neighborhoods, it's been few and far between. And so we've been tracking the numbers with, you know, an epidemiologist, with other public health crises workers who have really been able to display not only that the underreporting of cases and the reason why that is, but also the number of deaths too. Looking at the number of deaths, following the number of deaths from a state standpoint, and actually looking at the reasoning of why the numbers are so low. So I'm in a physician group, a medical group of like 110, you know, medical providers across the United States. And I posed the question, you know, that in Florida, for instance, our number of deaths are really low. And other people chimed in and said, yes, ours as well, we're following it, et cetera. And then when you look at the numbers that, like in a case like Florida, the politics around having the number of deaths so low, regardless of who's dying, black people are dying, you know, frontline workers are dying, et cetera, teachers are dying. But they're using these numbers to justify whether or not they should open up the economy. And so in reality, it's been an eye-opening moment of truth particularly for physicians, not only because now they figure out their relationship to capitalism, and because a lot of physicians are now employed by the hospital, then they get treated as such, like regular employees, like McDonald's workers. When they come to work, you know, you don't get what you need, you know, you're underappreciated, undervalued, et cetera, regardless of how much you get paid. But also they're starting to see the breakdown of government as well. So I think in this moment, we're seeing a lot of physicians who have actually become radicalized to unionize, to call out government, to be very vocal. And so it's just a really interesting time. But also on the ground, you know, with just testing people is just very political, because people don't want to know the real numbers, you know? Because if there are 1,000 homeless people that test positive, then all of a sudden 1,000 homeless people need to be housed by the government. And so the numbers are kept low from you know, a political standpoint, from the state level and also from the local level, because people don't want to show you the inadequacies of government. And I think that at the very least, that's what this pandemic has done, has been able to show people who normally think that the government works for them. Of course, Black people know that the government doesn't work for them, but particularly, you know, like white people, et cetera, you know, those who are in, you know, upper class, they're seeing the actual breakdown of government in real time. And it's been very interesting.
Amika, could you talk about what UMedics has been seeing at the day-to-day?
Yeah, for the most part, we've got a lot of medical professionals and folks who are responsible for care for somebody else. So we weren't able to do a lot of the kind of boots on the ground, passing out of supplies, mutual aid stuff that a lot of other folks are doing, which we appreciate. We did partner with Equity and Transformation, EAT, to help them do a little bit of that. And we have been focusing on doing webinars on the intersection of what asthma looks like in this COVID pandemic, particularly like when people are being turned away from ERs. Asthma was our second module after gunshot wounds. We really wanted to do something a little bit lighter. People always say, like, I hate that you have to teach people gunshot wound first response. And, and so it was a little bit lighter, but also asthma for us is just, there really should not be many asthma deaths. It really just shouldn't happen. If we would, be able to address environmental racism, strong people had quality access to healthcare, the number of asthma deaths should go down greatly. So we're really looking to prevent more people, more loss of folks from asthma, and talking about how you handle asthma in the now, and also how to advocate for yourself or your loved one if the emergency room is telling you no.
I'd like to maybe bring Dean and Mariame back into the conversation quickly and ask you all to kind of give your perspective on a similar question, which is whether you all are thinking about particular communities and populations, or maybe geographies of people that are also in severe need of solidarity, of so-called mutual aid, et cetera, during this pandemic. Let me start with you, Mariame.
Sure. I mean, I think it's been spoken to already. Everybody who's most vulnerable, the people who have the least access to resources and power, are obviously always at greatest need. But I do want to just reiterate the fact that people are already doing mutual aid for each other in those spaces every day. It's why and how they're able to survive in the first place. So this isn't something new that anybody's bringing to anybody. It's not some sort of program that comes off a shelf. It's just survival work on the day-to-day basis. So I just want people to really stay with that notion and understand that notion. It isn't a missionary kind of service. So the other thing that I think is really important, at least for me right now, is the work is mostly, there's been an explosion of kind of, semi-visible and visible mutual aid spaces, networks, hubs, whatever you want to call them. And I think our work going forward is going to be, how do we connect and link all these resources, all these, networks? How do we, you create your hub, but then your hub connects with another hub that connects with another hub. That's going to be a test of how we build real power that we can actually use and deploy in the service of ourselves and in a pushback against the state, and creating new alternatives outside of the state. So I've been thinking a lot about that, about how are we going to be able to do that? Because that to me feels like the urgent thing in the moment, regardless of whether the person who wins, quote unquote, the presidency is a Democrat or a Republican. It doesn't matter. We're going to have to continue and expand our networks of support and help given what's going on in the world. So let's keep working on that. Last thing I do want to say is, I think both for myself and Dean, maybe it seems a little bit strange for people maybe who don't know us or whatever, but I've been engaged in doing this kind of work for the entire time that I've been organizing, which has been for 35 years. This is not a new thing. And while I started building organization, as part of all of the organizations that I've worked in, we've been actualizing mutual aid because we have to. So whether it was starting a program called Families in Touch in Chicago, where we gave rides to the families of kids who were incarcerated in a particular youth prison 10 years ago. Whether it's the work of Liberation Library, which gives, sends books to young people on the inside and asks them to correspond with us too, so that we learn about them. Whether it's creating letter writing events and doing that for a million zillion years. Whether it's, the list goes on, I think, and whether it's Survived and Punished in our work that we're doing with Commissary Fund and supporting people on the inside directly. So I don't see this as a separate part of organizing. It is organizing. It's got to be an integral part of your organizing, because you're working with people who are most vulnerable. You have to ensure people's survival needs at all times. And if you're not doing that, then I'm not sure what you're doing. And so I just want people to think about, as we're moving forward, that this isn't extra work. This is the work. It's the work connected to the big analytical thinking, people's readings, whatever. All that's great. All that's necessary. But without actually connecting to making sure people have their material needs met, what is it, Cabral? People aren't fighting for ideas, but actually for their day-to-day sustenance and survival. We are thinkers that we admire have taught us this over and over again. So I just wanted to put a fine point on that, because I think it's important to keep that in mind.
No, it's such a critical point, because this thing we're calling mutual aid it's an integral part of any grassroots organizing method. Mutual aid is a method, right? And so it's a question of what kind of politics and analysis and movement it's tied to. So that's such a critical point. I don't think that's a fine point. I think that's a major, major, major point that you just highlighted for us. Amika, you wanted to add something?
I just also wanted to add that the skill part is really, really important. And Miriam saying these are skills, that we're taking. All of our grandmothers grew food and sewed and stitched people up, because there were no doctors coming that couldn't afford them. And so redeveloping those skills is really important. I'm just hoping that whoever is seeing this, there's street medic community collectives in almost every major city, and short of that, talk to your friends and neighbors about what can happen, what's likely to happen, what skills you have, how do you grow those skills, and depend on and support each other, because this is still part of the drill, right? So we know that with climate change, we're going to see a lot more really bad storms where we're really going to have to just depend on each other.
Dean, maybe let me throw to you to see if there's any way that you'd want to elaborate or respond to the call out that Mariame and really everybody has been giving throughout this conversation, which is how do we at the same time that we're acknowledging the long histories of solidarity, of care, of mutual aid, of security building among vulnerable communities and peoples, is there something about this particular moment that gives an opportunity or really kind of highlights the necessity to bring all this different work together into some kind of broader network of collaboration, of solidarity, or something else? I mean, because you're kind of one of the principal folks that I've been going to think about that question.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say too, just building off what Mariame just said, what we're seeing happen right now, the national push and all this intense state work to try to get governors to use their clemency powers to let people out of prison, the intensity of that work is directly sourced by the decades of mutual aid work to prisoners leading up to that, because that's how we know what the conditions are. People who we're supposed to be separated from and supposed to not know. These deep relationships between people inside and outside is what allows the work for the big push. It's what allows people who've been doing, prison education projects inside certain prisons are the ones who are able to finagle to get soap into prisoners right now. It's the long-term, often not very glamorous mutual aid work in the moments where there's just the ordinary horrible crises of capitalism, white supremacy, that allows when there's the peak crisis where more people suddenly are like, oh, wow, look, there are certain people who are more vulnerable, where we can spin up to even greater level of mobilization. So I think it really is deeply connected. I think one thing I'll say, Dylan, about your question about how do we, in this question Miriam's asking, how do we, one way people might ask that is how do we scale up? And I think that I have a very strong opinion about this, which is that scaling up and increasing our coordination our solidarity, our respect for each other's practices, and our awareness of them is not about building one big organization. It's not about that's what's wrong with the state, is it tries to solve local problems through one centralized, like they extract from you and then they're supposed to give some kind of care back, and it misses all the local conditions on the ground. It misses all the specificities and knowledges and wisdom, which is actually the best way to respond to disasters. People who are right there know each other best. They know, oh, down the block there's a person who has a medical device that needs a battery and we're out of power. They know who's where. We learn that every time there is any kind of disaster, that the people in communities know the most. So we're not looking to scale up in the sense of standardizing, homogenizing, centralizing authority. What we're looking to do is increase our capacity to have more people plugged in. So one thing you see people talking about a lot is if you're building a neighborhood pod and the pod gets to be 15, 20 people, gets to be 40 people, maybe break it into two. Actually, we want to proliferate mutual aid projects. We want to proliferate organizations. We want more and more people to be in groups where they feel heard and seen, where they know they can express their opinion, where they can make decisions together. Those are the skills we need. We need to be skilling towards connection instead of isolation, which is what our current experiences in this kind of culture lead us to. So I just want to suggest that because I just think I have this conversation with a lot of people where people think scaling up, what we need is to scale up in the sense that this would be like a national political party based on mutual aid or something. I really don't think that's the case. I think we need to scale up by having more people mobilized in ways where they're really connected to each other and actually participating, not where they've got some representative somewhere saying something for them, right? That's our problem with our current government, is that's a deeply non-participatory.
For everybody that's viewing and listening to this conversation, I'm going to make sure that there's a significant list of links, of readings and so forth in the description of this video that folks can refer to, so that you really don't have an excuse to not find a way to get involved in whatever form of mutual aid organizing is happening right near you right now. So I want to express my appreciation to all of you. I want to say, this is going to be an invaluable resource for the students, the organizers, the activists, the teachers, the scholars, the researchers who are taking a look at this. I have deep sense of gratitude to all of you, and I just want to express my appreciation. So thank you all.